Welcome everyone. It's good to be back with you again. It's 4 o'clock Pacific time, and that's Pacific Daylight, so everybody's in their own respective time zone. We want to welcome you today. I'm of course Bill Code, and you can learn more about me at drbillcode.com, DRBILLCODE, and this of course is my colleague Kristina Mitz.
Hi.
Kristina is a therapist and with a lot of nutritional background, and now a lot of expertise with the microbiome, but other components in the healing journey, because just like me, you're on a long-term healing journey yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's what most of us are. You know, I think if there's a goal today, or any of these that we do, it's primarily to empower you as an individual to enhance your own health. So some of you will have a health challenge, and some of you may not, but you may be striving for optimal health. I'm happy enough to have recovered enough from my MS that I'm now striving, I guess, closer to optimal health. Mm-hmm. And within optimal health, of course, is good brain health. Now at the almost 67 years of stage, it's time to reassess and look at the next 10, 20, or 30 years, and hopefully would do it with a keen and bright mind. So I see some familiar faces on, so it's great to have you aboard. It's now a good time to, if you want to let other people know about this from your Facebook. What's the right term, Chief?
You can share this video on your page, and that'll let other people know that we're live.
Yeah. And further to that, again, we are continuing to post these at the drbillcode.com website, and you can get them there either as a podcast audio only or as in a replay of this, because I'm not naive enough to think that everybody is on Facebook. Mm-hmm. Some people of my era are not, and some people are all over it, and some people older than I am are all over Facebook. But it's an excellent way that we can link in with people and keep things going. So today we want to talk primarily about detoxification. This is, of course, the first chapter in my book, Solving the Brain Puzzle. And detoxification has a pretty broad term to it. It's not a term that's talked about very much in regular medicine at all. I mean, my background's anesthesiology, and toxification and toxicity is a big deal. We always talk about drug toxicity and other types of toxicity. And we use many of the same principles that are talked about in detoxification. And our goal today is to make those available to you so you can reason them out and think them out. Certainly we know some drugs. I remember one drug that we got in the 1970s. It was called cimetidine. Some of you will remember it as Tagamet. It's virtually not used now. And it was to reduce acid secretion. It was the very first one of the histamine receptor 2 blockers, so that you could now treat ulcers without surgery. Surgery was the common treatment at that time, with the vagotomy and pyloroplasty, which most of you won't even hear about. I mean, it was bread and butter to a great deal for the general surgeons, and then it changed. But Tagamet had a couple of interesting side effects because it hugely reduced detoxification, because it shut down the P450 pathway, or the many enzymes within the liver, which are the mainstay of how we break things down, whether it's toxins from, weed sprays and herbicides, or whether it's toxins from heavy metals or anything that we ingest. And cimetidine was such a surprise to people because it killed a number of people in the intensive care unit, because people were on it, and all of a sudden their morphine lasted much more, stacked up, and they had a few respiratory deaths. Wow. Because you just keep adding them on and you don't take them away. It's maybe a good analogy to begin with, because now we realize that there's things in our diet that we take in which work the same. Mm-hmm. I'm of course thinking about glyphosate or Roundup, because it shuts down that same set of pathways to a great degree. And that's why it's very critical in any of us that have the side effects of lingering either toxins that we've taken in or lingering medications that we've taken in, because it makes a huge difference in how we might work on that. So, and I think it extends into glyphosate, of course. Well, I know we've approached it before, but it's critical because it gives us a useful tool to understand how you might detoxify your body.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think you made some notes and you're going to put those online.
Mm-hmm.
Saunas are fabulous because that takes it out through the sweat. Sweat, of course, is how we partly get rid of anesthetics. I still remember coming home after doing anesthetics, even though it's a while ago now, it's over 20 years, but my dog wouldn't go near me because I was excreting halothane or isoflurane or some of the anesthetic agents that I'd encountered during the day just by being in the same room, and it comes out in my pores and my skin.
Mm-hmm.
So don't underestimate the many ways you can detoxify. But I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, since you mentioned phase 1 detox, which is the CYP450 enzymes and the other CYP enzymes, that is the first stage of liver detoxification. So no matter what you are detoxifying, it's going to go through that pathway first with those enzymes. And so you're going to want to support your body's production of those enzymes. And there are a couple key nutrients, B vitamins being the first of those nutrients. So if you can eat leafy greens, those tend to be quite rich in the B vitamins that you need. And organ meat as well. So liver is a really good source of B vitamins. And then from there are multiple pathways that your body can use to detox. So some of the other pathways that they might go through secondarily to the CYP pathway would be glucuronidation, you might go through sulfation, you might go through methylation, or you might go through the kidneys and the skin. So your skin is the largest organ on your entire body. So definitely you can absorb toxins that way as well as excrete them that way.
Yeah, unfortunately, the skin is usually, blocks those issues, but it doesn't always. You're right. And so we've talked a bit about the first part of the pathway, and then we're going to go on and talk about 2. But one really important step I would really like to focus and emphasize, because the body is quite a wondrous ability to detoxify, but it can't really work at it if you're still taking in toxins which either block the detoxification, or they literally overload the system. So until you start to reduce what you're putting in, you're not going to detoxify. In fact, if you do clean up everything you're putting in the air, water, and food, your body will do a great job. So that's a bit tricky. It's quick to say, but it means going mostly organic and mostly supporting your microbiome. So that's that broad range of fruits and vegetables. In fact, if you eat that in your diet, it'll get you out of a lot of problems. I mean, a lot of problems and a lot of secondary troubles. But what we'd like to do is give you kind of the awareness of the big ones. I think most of you realize now that if you're eating pesticide or herbicide-laden foods, and glyphosate's my number one hate, of course, but it's also the number one used. And it's used as a desiccation, of course, on wheat, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and so on. I know I sound a bit like a broken record, but it's very critical one to reduce that particular one. So it's an interesting year. I mean, we've got COVID-19 happening all around us. It's still a big anxiety, but people have shifted to growing their own foods better. I think it's going to be a big learning curve for some people because they haven't gardened before. In fact, we get more questions this year, I would think, than we have had in the last 10. Because everybody's starting to catch on. So that's one way to control your access to food, but also what goes into growing the food. And then it's much healthier. It can do a lot better job for you. And if we can reduce the toxins going in, so it's a bit tricky to clean up your air. But, as I mentioned in chapter 1 in the book, if you're living in a fairly toxic area, and so this would be in and around the lower part of southern Ontario, other select parts of Canada, certainly the northeast part of the United States, all the way almost from New York to Chicago, that whole belt, which of course is where Ontario goes down into, those folks might be well advised to put in a HEPA filter in their home so they can have some clean air part of the time. Just to go back to the particulate matter, it seems that some of the worst crises from the COVID-19 virus has been where there's really poor quality air. So we take that in and around the northern parts of Italy, New York, certainly the Wuhan part of China. Each of these areas had major problems with the quality of their air because the virus, the COVID-19 virus, it is 0.125 microns. Okay, so that's 125 nanometers, but that's really tiny. And pieces of particulate matter in the air that are 2.5 microns, so what's that, 200 times more than the other? So they attach to it and they move around in the air. And when we're breathing particulate matter within the air, it not only irritates the airways, but it carries in the virus in a lot larger load.
I would also add to that, because we're coming into fire season here, and we don't know what kind of season it's going to be like, but if you're in an area where there are forest fires, you may want to take extra steps to support yourself as well. So,
Yeah.
I mean, for us, it wasn't last year, but the year before, we had really bad fires, and so I was really grateful that I had access to an oxygen concentrator. That was really helpful. But you can also use antioxidants to help yourself recover from the damage that's caused by constantly breathing in those particulates. So really high antioxidant foods, anything really colorful, so all the colorful vegetables, as well as coffee, tea, cocoa, berries, herbs like turmeric are really great as well.
And that's why some of us, if we're lucky enough to have air conditioning or, some other variation of that with a heat pump or whatever, but the filters in those need to be changed, and they need to be changed much more often if we get the problem with forest fires. I know my daughter lives in the Okanagan, and when they have forest fires there, she's been much better off in the last year or two because she was able to finally put in an air conditioner within the home, and then she can close the windows at night, because if it hangs there for 2 or 3 days, I mean, you're not getting a break from it.
Yeah.
And so some variation of those filters for that fine particulate matter really makes a huge difference. And it's a really important entity in the homes when we can move away, for example, from off-gassing of carpets or all the other many things that grow within carpets, and we go closer to either leather furniture or wooden floors. Each of these are a huge reduction in the dust particles and the problems they're in, whether that's, I guess, dust mite allergies, right from our pillow to everything else around us. We have to really keep those under control because they get into our breathing, into our airway, and they mess up everything. So that's the air component, and then of course, water component.
Well, actually, just one thing. So it's interesting that you brought up dust mites, because my only real allergy is dust mites.
Yeah.
And ever since I found that out, I am extra on it about washing my sheets and my pillows. So every couple months I take the actual pillows and wash the pillows, and I change the sheets quite frequently, and I'll have multiple layers for sheets and pillowcases. So if you have a dust mite allergy, that can help.
And it's a really common problem. And most of us struggle with it, and we don't realize, and we don't get a decent sleep because everything is congested. We're not breathing optimally, and everything kind of recycles. In some of us, we're unlucky. It triggers reactive airway disease or asthma. So it's a really important care of that bedroom. And so many of us have gone to either linoleum or a wooden floor in the bedroom because we want to really reduce all of these other sites.
Carpet
things to grow.
cleaners as well.
Carpet cleaners are a challenge, and it's really hard to get carpet just right.
Yeah.
And you can't wash it. Well, you can wash it to a degree,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's hard to get it under control.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
so-
you're saying water.
Yeah, so then on to water, right? And we're pretty blessed in this part of the world. We're in the Cowichan Valley, where it's one of the cleanest rivers in the world. In fact, some of the wells are so clean, they don't even need to add chlorine to the water. So it's very much a challenge wherever you live, and just because they say the tap water is fine, that doesn't mean it's necessarily good for you to keep down your burden of troubles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know you're very, conscientious about the water. You'll carry it with you. We're lucky we happen to be on an acreage and the water is really clean, happily. We treat it with an ultraviolet filter as far as its bacterial component. But the big thing we want to do is minimize what it's contaminated with. So, as we've talked a bit about before, it was well asked by Dean from Australia, right? Can glyphosate, for example, the Roundup component, come in the rain? Well, it can to some degree come in the rain. It certainly comes in the washing off the fields, so it's stored in reservoirs. So many of us have a reservoir where it's storing that, among other things that are contaminating the water. And even the chlorine itself, when it's used in significant large amounts, you're much better to let it sit in the fridge overnight with a filter to at least dissipate that. The example I always use for clients is, well, if you take your goldfish or your fish in your aquarium and you put in straight tap water, many of them will die overnight. So that's not such a good indicator. But if you let it sit overnight, many, many less fish will die. Okay? So most of us don't go to the tap and let it sit overnight, but we might be advised to do that. And then, of course, the next step, as far as minimizing contact in your city, if I was in a major city, I would put a reverse osmosis filter at least under the sink for the drinking water.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't actually, the chloramines, when the chlorine binds with the organic matter, that can't dissipate by just leaving it sitting there. Nor if you try to boil it off, that's not going to work either. So you may as well just get a filter.
That's right. That's right. And so people have asked in the past, can I do it with a ceramic filter and a superfine filter? Well, you're not going to get any of your pesticides or herbicides out that way, because they're dissolved right in the water, and even same with heavy metals. Some of us will live in an area where there's coal-fired energy plants. Okay, well, you're going to have at least a 25-mile radius around that where you're going to have significant arsenic, and it's going to be in the water as well. So heavy metals, unfortunately, dissolve to some degree within the water, and so that's why we need to clean that up as much as we can. And if you're in any doubt at all, I would recommend the reverse osmosis filter, and then either pinches of Himalayan salt or sea salt,
Some form of
something
sea
to
salt.
put the minerals back in. Some of you will go the extra mile, and you'll even buy a unit which adds those minerals back in at your kitchen sink or wherever you happen to have it in your house. But it also will make a big difference for how much it's able to restore even the alkalinity within the water. A little bit more alkaline water.
Yeah. So for us at the clinic, what I do is I just add back in, we have like an electrolyte solution, so I'll add that back in. I'll do the same thing at home, but I have more options at home, so I might use sea salt, or I might actually add a bit of like celery juice, cucumber juice, or because it's summer, watermelon juice to my water, and those are quite mineral rich as well.
Yeah, and so that's good. And watermelon's an interesting one because it's a great electrolyte sustainer. I would think it's probably as good as Gatorade.
I would.
It's
I like it better
way
than
more
Gatorade.
tasty. I'm not a huge fan of that flavor, but it has its options. It replaces those. And I know when people are exercising now or cycling long days, the bananas become a little bit more popular again because it provides some of those nuances when you're losing it and doing lots of sweating and so on. And of course, we mentioned sauna earlier. whether this sauna is infrared, or whether it's steam, or whether it's heat only, more typical of maybe the Finnish model. Those are great, but as you sweat all those things and you sweat out a lot of those things that you should be sweating out, that's great. However, you got to replace those electrolytes to some degree.
Yeah.
And now that we've got the water all cleaned up, we want to be using a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
What, eight
8 glasses a day.
8 glasses a day, a glass being a cup.
Yep.
Yeah, fair enough. And so that's exactly right, because the typical hint is dilution, the solution for pollution. And I use that quote in my book because people need to think of it more often, and that's the advantage. Because one of our long-term problems, and I'm sensitive to this now because I've got reduced kidney function, any number of reasons for it, not diabetes and not hypertension. Those are the two big, most common ones, okay? But I'm very sensitive to it, so I'm really looking hard at lots of fluids to keep that under control, and then also to reduce the acid intake, okay? And alkalizing, making the fluids in the body more alkaline, the very best way, lots of multicolored fruits and vegetables, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I know we keep coming back to that, but it's a big part of the mainstay of being well.
Yeah. Well, did we want to answer some questions? We've
Sure,
got a
let's have a
couple.
look.
So Wendy is asking, as far as detoxifying and fasting for autophagy, I'm confused as to how often and how long to water fast. I do intermittent fasting 6 days a week, but the water fast only in spring for a maximum of 3 days. I get very dizzy. So there are some charts out there that you can look at that show which days during water fasting you hit what benefits, and it seems like by and large the most benefits accumulate by day 5. So if you're going to do a water fast, if you can do 5 or 6 days, that's probably the ideal, but I wouldn't do it that often because, like we've been saying, you actually need a lot of nutrients for continuous detoxification. And same thing with the intermittent fasting. I maybe wouldn't do it every day or even every week because it, depending on the person, I don't know what your situation is or your health condition is like, but it can be kind of hard on the hormones. So yeah, I would definitely make sure to give yourself breaks.
Yeah, and so let's talk about those in a couple of different paces. I mean, the way I look at it, to enhance my body function, I aim for 3 to 4 days a week where I do 13 to 15 hours of fasting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I'll still have water in those times, and I think black tea and black coffee still fit, and green tea still fits. And I'm not as keen on, water only fasting. I think it's much better to have some degree of electrolyte sustenance in there in some shape or form, whether that's liquids with diluted fruit juices or whichever way you can do it. It is a lot safer. I mean, I think back to a few years ago, I think they had an iPad prize, and they had a radio station, and people were seeing how much water they could drink. Well, unfortunately, the person who won died because if you go water only for a huge amount during a day or for several days, you're running the thin edge of the wedge, being short of sodium, potassium, and other electrolytes, okay? But those are the very big two. Mm-hmm. And so if you're putting components back in, whether, as you're doing with Himalayan salt or sea salt, all well and better, okay? Pure water all on its own is not great in excess amounts because you still need the other electrolytes. And this goes in a little bit with Shelley's question. She's changed to reverse osmosis, and it's demineralized water. We do need minerals. We don't have to necessarily get them in the water, but we could get them if we added some watermelon or other choices to re-put the minerals back in the water. Mm-hmm. And that's very much an individual journey, but pure demineralized water all only It's not very healthy.
No, and it's not really gonna truly hydrate you, at least not on a cellular level.
Yeah, because the water moves around in the body. Yes, we're at least 70% water, no question about it. But it's always water with the electrolytes in it. Outside the cells, it's primarily sodium in the water within our bodies. Inside the cells, it's primarily potassium. And they're both critically important, and that's one reason electrolytes are followed so closely. I remember back in my intern days, this is a long time ago, but over the Christmas season, some people would forget and they would leave somebody on a D5W drip only. So that's sugar water with water. And after a couple of days, this person would get drowsy or behave abnormally. And all of a sudden, what was happening? They were getting so short of sodium that they weren't well.
Right.
So in fact, they solved the problem medically to some degree because they made something called 2/3, 1/3. So that was, there was saline enough in the water, and it was not as strong as the pure saline it would use to replace blood loss and so on. And then you would alternate it with some components of sugar. So that would give you 400 calories a day because you needed roughly 3 liters a day that you were giving intravenously. And so those of us that were thinking about it, I could get up to 600 calories a day by alternating saline with D5W or saline with sugar in it. So anyway, those things are aside, that's when you're going intravenously. No one's going to be doing that at home. I wouldn't recommend it anyway. But it does give you the clues. Too much pure water or water with sugar only doesn't work because you need to have those electrolytes. Key ones are sodium, potassium, but the other trace electrolytes and minerals are really important too.
Mm-hmm. The next question is about heavy metals, and I can probably answer that because I'm dealing with mercury myself. So, is it true that cilantro detoxifies metals? So if we're thinking about things that detoxify metals, we often refer to them as binders, and there are weak binders and there are strong binders. Cilantro is actually a weaker binder. So when your body is detoxifying things like metals, it's kind of like playing a game of hot potato. So it's going to pick up the metal with something, some form of binder, and then if it's not a strong binder, it's actually going to drop it somewhere, and you're going to have to wait until something else picks it up. So if you're using weak binders to detoxify metals, then you're just contributing to redistribution of metals throughout the body, which can cause even more problems. So depending on the metals you're dealing with, there's going to be binders that are specific to that type of metal, and you're probably going to want to choose some binders that are medium and stronger in strength. And in order to do that, you're probably going to want to work with someone who is very familiar with binders and metals.
And so, often those can be done orally, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're obviously on that path already. The advantage of, the chlorophyll containing things, and, the one you mentioned is exactly that. It does help reduce a lot of relatively organic toxins that are available. So it's a great thing to have as part of your regimen.
Mm-hmm.
As far as heavy metals, lead, arsenic, I guess aluminum's coming into it, but certainly mercury. My favorite is to reduce those, at least by putting in less, okay? So that's one thing.
Yep.
It's a long, slow process. You can do it aggressively sometimes with intravenous chelation, okay? So that's EDTA, and that's only to be done in experienced hands. It's not something you can do at home. Even if you're using the very potent oral binders, DMSA and DMSO, not DMSO, but DMPS, thank you. Those can be used at home in capsule form, but they need to be used slowly, gradually, over time. So you're talking about a detox over several months or even over several years to dilute it. I've been really high in lead and mercury for a very long time, but I think slowly am getting a hold of it now. We don't want to rush into the intravenous side very often. A, it's expensive. B, you need somebody that's good at it. But you can do a lot of those changes yourself. But number one is quit putting them in. So
Mm-hmm.
if you've got mercury in your mouth, like we've talked about before, get it out, but get it out with a qualified biologic or similarly trained dentist who knows what they're doing and what to add in to the same time. And I spend a whole, chapter on the dental components in the book, so that's a place to go. Lead, lead is, I probably got a lot of mine from leaded gasoline. That's not as common. The side tip, if you could get somewhere where they'll pump your gas for you,
Yeah.
let them do it, because that reduces the amount that you take in of those biologic problems, okay? I know it's not ideal for the person working there, but hopefully they've learned it. And then when you travel to California, you've got right away, there's something right around the gas pump into the car. It's taking most of those fumes away.
Right.
Kind of suction device.
Well, they say for my generation these days, we inherit most of the lead from our mothers, who were
Okay.
exposed to more. But also in terms of mercury, so mercury is in some really interesting things. It's in Comet and it's in Clorox, but it's also in seafood. So if you are eating really high up on the food chain with your seafood, you might be accumulating more lead. So you might want to aim to eat lower down on the seafood food chain if you've got mercury.
Well, for sure. And so you might eliminate swordfish and these sorts of things, but think about it also, you never ideally want tuna or salmon that's more than 10 pounds or, 4.5 kilograms. You don't always get the size of it, but you know the strains of it. So if you're buying sockeye salmon, it's always going to be smaller. The other advantage of sockeye salmon is it's a plankton feeder. Consequently, it doesn't eat a bunch of things that have eaten mercury-containing components. So that's a big advantage. Whereas if you're taking a large salmon or a large tuna, they've eaten a lot of small fish that had increasing amounts in them.
Yeah.
Shellfish, because they're fairly short cycle, usually aren't as bad. It's the bottom-dwelling fish, because that's where there's a big focus on the mercury piece.
Right.
And then, of course, as always, if you're especially vulnerable, so in pregnancy, you might be really limiting the amount that you take in. This is the methyl mercury. The really touchy one that some of us have had a fair bit of is the ethyl mercury. And it's the ethyl mercury that's been typically used as the preservative in vaccines. And so the tip for the day is, if you're going to take a vaccine, okay, but if you're going to take a flu vaccine, for example, pay the extra money and get a single dose vial. Because if it's a multi-dose vial, usually it's got mercury or something in it as a relative preservative to the issue. It isn't worth it for you because the ethyl mercury tends to go right to the brain, which is the last place that we want it or need it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then also still on the metals, but also kind of related to Bruce's next question about liver detox, it can be hard to detoxify metals if you've got certain genetic variants. So, I mean, we hear a lot about the MTHFR genetic variants, and then there are partners to that as well. So I don't have an MTHFR variant, but I do have MTR variants. So that makes it harder for me to detoxify metals, and there are things you can do nutritionally and with supplements to help support yourself.
And those are reasons that you might be on the path. If you're not healthy and well now, or you can seem to have a problem eating or drinking something when everybody else does okay, that's probably an individual variation in your pathways. So ideally you need to figure out what is the right optimal way for you to eat and maybe take some supplements to help that out. We can't change our genes. We can change our blue genes to a different pair, but we can't change our genes. However, as we've talked about before, you can change how your genes respond and work for you and with you. So that's the epigenetic change, okay? So that changes how our genes can work. So the MTHFR, I am one of those variants. I'm in the, sort of the heterozygous group, so I don't have it dramatically so, but I monitor, for example, my homocysteine, and that's one I want you to write down and learn about or read about in the book, Solving the Brain Puzzle, because if you know your individual homocysteine and it's in a nice low range of below 8, so much the better. But if it isn't, then you as an individual probably need extra B6, B12, and folate. And most of those can be taken in a multivitamin, but if you're uncertain about it, then fine. Find someone who can help you with it. That might be an integrative medicine doc, it might be a naturopath, in some cases it'll be a chiropractor, but you need some advice to help you on that journey.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you want to comment on Bruce's question. So he's asking, what is the best way to detoxify an inflamed liver?
Sure. Well, the inflamed liver is a really important question. We've all heard of, alcoholic cirrhosis, and we know that that's a common theme. Equally as common now and more common is non-alcoholic fatty liver. Mm-hmm. All right. So there's a number of things you can do, and of course, the obvious ones are minimize your alcohol intake to, or perhaps to none, depending on your individual journey and addiction and so on. Give up smoking forever, for good, because it never helps the whole scenario. And then you need to really make an advantage to helping the liver recover. So any of the things that reduce the liver enzyme function, glyphosate keeps coming to mind, because that's critical. You're not going to solve it. The other aggravating feature of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is high fructose corn syrup. Mm-hmm. So high fructose corn syrup means no soda pop that's made in Canada, United States, because it's only high fructose corn syrup. And it's the high amount of fructose in it has to be broken down in the liver to change to glucose. The body can tolerate most fruits. If they're natural fruits in their natural state, there's some fructose, absolutely. But it can tolerate those. It's just when you give it a big slam, if you do a big Slurpee per day, or you do a couple bottles of some variation of soda pop, bad news, and dynamite on the liver.
Mm-hmm. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is also connected to the microbiome, so anything you can do to help balance the microbiome and reduce those microbes that are producing toxins such as LPS, that's going to be helpful as well.
And we did pretty good today. We're 40 minutes and we have deferred microbiome, but the microbiome is your very best friend. It teams up with the liver, and things cycle back and forth between the gut and the liver through the bile salts and so on. And if you've got a healthy microbiome, which again, those 40 to 50 different foods per week, and mostly it's going to be fruits and vegetables and healthy spices, then that's going to work, because a lot of detoxification can happen within the liver. Mm-hmm. I just read another paper, really well done about glyphosate, and of course it particularly lets the body develop an excess amount of salmonella in the body, Salmonella typhi. Okay, because that's concentrated in the bile. Gallstones can actually recur and let it keep happening. And unfortunately, that's one that does really well in an individual that keeps eating glyphosate-containing foods, because it poisons the others. And so now we can spend an extra moment or two on what probiotics should I really focus on. If you're trying to get your liver to work better and detoxification to work better in the body, you want to be really focusing on the lactobacillus and to some degree the bifidus group. Mm-hmm. So those are two of your number one probiotics, and maybe you're going to switch back and forth. Ideally, you're going to do a lot of them with fermented foods, and I'll forget one or two here, so help me out. But kefir, kombucha, sauerkraut, kimchi.
Yeah, those are some good ones. So lactobacillus responds strongest to something like kefir, especially if it's traditionally made and not just from the grocery store. So if you have time to make kefir, that's going to be awesome. You can also buy kefir powders now. I think there's one called Kef Pro or Pro, something like that, but that's a pretty decent one. I've actually been kind of frustrated this week. I've seen a bunch of stool tests from people who, everyone these days seems to be on like a low carb, low starch, low this or that diet, or the paleo diets as well without the legumes. So I'm seeing a lot of people right now who it's really hard for them to grow lactobacillus and bifidobacteria naturally. You want to grow your own endogenous microbes if you can, and Some of the best things to grow the lactobacillus and the bifidobacteria are the legumes. It's things like konjac. And then, I mean, there are easier things as well, like cranberries and some of the other berries, but definitely, these limiting diets limit you.
It's a challenge. The one advantage, when we talk about fats, a high fat diet, okay, and a healthy, saturated and unsaturated fat, but a healthy fat diet has one perk for it, is that it has a lot less secondary issues created in the body, because the fats actually burn cleaner than the carbohydrates do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's one reason to think about in the benefit. The challenge within paleo is sometimes you're over the top on the amount of protein you're taking in.
Mm-hmm.
So the protein can create a problem, particularly in the kidney, if the kidney is challenged. So you want enough protein to do well, and you want to be away from the glyphosate, because then you can make, those aromatic rings of tryptophan and the other important proteins within that, methionine. But you need to get the balance. So you can do a high-fat diet because it burns cleaner, but you still need that big variety of fruits and vegetables,
Exactly.
especially vegetables.
So you can still include something like konjac in whatever quantity is appropriate for the diet that you're on.
And konjac is made from a seed?
It's a root.
It's a root,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. Not in every grocery store.
No, it's not. But you could also include legumes, which are everywhere.
Legumes are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And legumes are really well suited, but if you're hugely strict paleo, they're not on the list, are they?
Mm-hmm. But I mean, there's a difference between being on a strict diet because you actually don't tolerate those things, or because you're seeing benefits from that diet, and then just choosing to not eat those things because why not?
I mean, for more than 15 years, we've been growing beans, that are dried beans, because they're a great variation in the diet. Maybe you don't need them every day, although parts of the world get by pretty well on beans and rice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's more your economy version to do that.
Right.
So we got a couple more questions. We should check those out.
Okay. Does EDTA orally really help with the metals?
Well, sure, it does. But you're going to need to be on the EDTA under strict supervision. And this EDTA is typically given intravenously. So you need somebody who knows what they're doing. I don't recommend it. I mean, I did 10 go-rounds on them, and it was interesting. This is early on in my MS, so more than 20 years ago. And since then I've learned I would much rather do a slow, controlled, gradual reduction, because as you change things in the body, I mean, sure, I had all my mercury in my mouth taken out. That was a huge step forward, but it's a bit of a hiccup when you start to do that. There's an awful lot of lead in the bones, and so that's only going to come out really slowly and really gradually.
Yeah.
So I would suggest heavy metals, do it slowly, but for whatever you're doing, eliminate almost completely any amount that's going in. So really study carefully where those burdens are. Sometimes it's going to be in our food from where we are. Arsenic, typically when I travel in the United States, I will not eat commercial chicken if I can help it, because they use a lot of arsenic in the growing of commercial chicken. So if you can, use organic. And same happens, we talked a bit about the seafood angle, and of course grass-fed beef and lamb and all these other issues. If you're into the meat group, those are the choices you want to get, because you want to get away from any of those toxins which come down the loop. And of course, if the animals are fed glyphosate containing foods, soy and corn, which is a very dominant thing because it's relatively inexpensive, that carries over into the meat. So that's why you really want to think about what you're eating and where it's coming from.
Yeah. I think women also, we don't tend to realize that the birth control pill can also throw off our mineral balance and thus the metal balance as well. So if you've been on birth control for a number of years, that can actually drive up your copper, and copper can become toxic too. And then just back to the EDTA, because I've been working on my own mercury burden, I really looked into the different binders and the safety levels for each one, and EDTA had a lower safety level than the other ones, DMPS and DMSA, so just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and the other one that I like, if you're into this, is getting into fruit pectin. Okay, because pectin is a fabulous binder, and it will over time dramatically reduce that, as help the body clean it up. You know, there is some merit to that. You know, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. There's other sources of pectin, they're mostly from fruit things, and I think that the main pectins that I'm thinking of come from orange peel and lemon peel, and they're exquisitely useful to reducing those burdens. And so some people will use powders. I'm lazy, I don't like powders, but I'll use capsules. And the pectin taken gradually over time will also reduce that heavy metal burden.
Right. So, covered yet. Electrolyte drink with ginger, lemon, lime, honey, and sea salt with water. Is that okay? Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It's got a lot of advantages, probably head and shoulders over, you know, the old Gatorade. So, Wendy has another question about metal clips left in the body and if they oxidize inside your body over time. They probably don't oxidize much. Mostly they are stainless steel. In some people, they will have components of nickel, but that's not as common now. The bigger challenge we're seeing is not so much in these small clips. I mean, I've got a couple of small screws left from a fracture repair in my fifth metacarpal, but it's a matter of titanium is now hitting the news because people, when they have a hip replacement or a knee replacement and there's titanium in it, unfortunately that shaves off over time, and that circulates in the body, and that's not as inert as we wanted. If you get the option when you get an artificial joint, although I'd much rather you preferred and did well and so you didn't need one, but if you need one, go ceramic if you can. And the same happens with implants that you're going to get in your mouth. Ideally get them ceramic, all right, because that's much more inert. We don't want the mixture.
Okay, I have read that the bacteria don't get past the stomach acid alive with kefir, etc. A probiotic must be enteric coated. Not necessarily. So if you look at the studies on whatever the product is that you're using, if it has studies, or whatever the strain of probiotic you're using, it should say in those studies how long it lasted in the person and where it made it to. And then with the kefir, it's not just bringing in microbes through the way that it was produced, but it's also actually feeding the lactobacillus. So that's why I said kefir specifically.
Yeah, well, and so the other part of that is if you time them, more will get through, okay? So acid secretion probably peaks a few minutes after you start to eat, goes up. As we get older, we don't have as much acid secretion, so that's going to be less of a problem. If you're unfortunately on protein pump inhibitors to reduce acid secretion, it's not going to have any acid secretion, which isn't healthy, and I would like to, to taper off that, and that's why I put it in the chapter in the book, how to taper off those, because cold turkey, that doesn't work. You get too much rebound and too much pain. And so the other piece that fits in there is take them timing with the meal. Mm-hmm. And most of us would do well to take it probably on a full stomach, because then it's got a better chance of getting through in its entirety without them being eaten up. Sure, you can do enteric coating, but that is often more of a challenge, and you're going to spend a lot more money on them. But think about it for a minute. When we were getting the benefit of lactobacillus and bifidus in our foods, they're going through the same scenario, and most of them aren't enteric coated. In practical terms, they're just not. So it's a matter of timing, working it out, and trying to take it more on a full stomach or right after meals, I would suggest. Okay.
Also from Betty, any probiotic recommendations? So I usually recommend probiotics based on what sort of symptoms the person is dealing with, and the key to choosing a good probiotic is finding one that stands up in the research, and it should be researched down to the strain level. So if you're reading a probiotic label, it'll probably say something like Lactobacillus acidophilus. That's the species, and then next to it there should be a letter number combination. That's the strain. So you want to see that that strain stands up in the research. So I'm not really sure what symptoms you have, so I can't really recommend anything, but because we're speaking about Lactobacillus, Jarrow makes a couple good Lactobacillus probiotics.
Mm-hmm. And bifidus is a fairly common one too. Those are two of the mainstream ones out there. The other thing I suggest often, and I'm sure you do too, is rotate them around. Find out which ones work better for you, and then repeat them and rotate them, okay? Because we recognize that probiotics don't persist with us. Within a couple weeks of having the probiotics, then they are gone through the body because they have lost their wildness. Sure, and we talk about gut floral transplant, okay? That is a much more live entity, and in our world, optimal rectally, and that's how we do it at Taymount Canada. But the key thing about probiotics is variety is the key, number of them is the key. Some of the best companies have the best research on them, and some things are particular for dramatic response and dramatic benefit, and we can give you the nuances and have already, I think when we wrote it down. So go to the website, drbillcode.com, and you will continue to find options for what the specific problem is, what might be the strain that would work. The one very best researched over the years was VSL3. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's available anymore.
They changed the formula.
Yeah, so I don't think it's near as optimal as it once was. It was kind of the mainstay, but there's other very good ones that have come out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Shannon's actually mentioning a line. What do you think of a line? Yes, a line contains a strain that is very well researched. The only catch with a line is that I don't like the non-medicinal ingredients. So really, you're gonna have to try it and see if it helps you and if the non-medicinal ingredients are okay with you.
That's right, because some people put things in it which some of us don't tolerate. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're strict about a FODMAPs diet or all these other issues, you're going to have more problem finding one that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of ozone therapy?
Well, ozone therapy, I'm going to let you comment on it because I know you're doing it right now.
I do. I like ozone therapy. So it falls within the category of oxygen therapies, and anything you can do to get your oxygen up is going to be really, really good for you. I think that ozone gives you the opportunity to apply it to more specific areas in the body. So for example, you can do rectal ozone, you can get the cups and you can say do cupped ozone over the liver or your kidneys or adrenals, and then you could also do IV ozone, or you could hook it up to an ozone sauna. So there's lots of things you can do with ozone, but you could also do something like hyperbaric oxygen, which is equally as amazing, or you could get an oxygen concentrator.
Yeah, so just to spend a minute about it, ozone, I think the favorite, simplest, safest is ozonate the water and then drink it. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then, you know, many years ago, I did do that. Now I'm privileged. I live with a hyperbaric oxygen unit on our property, and I'm approaching 100 in the last, 3.5 months, because I've quit traveling, of course, lately with COVID, as everybody else has too. So oxygenation is very dramatic benefit, okay? And it's a great way to reduce inflammation in the body and improve oxygenation, and now all the mitochondria are working better, okay? We're going to talk eventually, when we get to chapter 8 or 9 within my book, we're going to talk about mitochondria specifically. But anytime you can add oxygen to the game, you are improving the function of the mitochondria. What do the mitochondria do? There's up to 1,000 in a cell. There's more in brain cells than any cell in the body. The only one that might rival it would be some of the heart cells. But if the mitochondria are working better, the cell's cleaning mechanism and function mechanism will all work better. It's just like enhancing the power plant And the component that works on the mitochondria is oxygen plus nutrition in the form of glucose in the cell or fat within the cell, because that's what burned. But if there's more oxygen available, almost all of those functions will work better. So it is a type of detoxification enhancement. Yeah.
Well, that's the end of the questions, but I just wanted to throw out one question that I sometimes get asked. So people ask me, well, doesn't your body just kind of detoxify on its own? Why do we have to do all these things to support the body to detoxify? And a simple answer is that we're prehistoric bodies, or prehistoric humans living in a modern world, and we're exposed to more toxins than we ever were. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a different answer.
Well, no, I think it's a good way to think about it. I mean, it's astronomical, the number of toxins that we've got in our air, water, and food. And so it's a game changer. Some of us can do pretty well for decades, and some of us have a problem even as young children, because maybe we've got a variation in our pathways, and so the toxin problems build up to a bigger deal. We need to talk about it all the time now, because there's been a huge reduction in the quality of our food, reduced minerals within it, and reduced nutrition within it with component toxins. And that's why it's worth thinking about what are the ways to optimize the body's function. And the liver and the lungs and the brain and the kidneys are all detoxifiers for us, including the skin. But they can't keep up if we don't minimize how much we're putting in. You know, we're getting up to the top of the hour. So I want to remind you again, you want to put less in the top end so that you can catch up from what you've taken in already. And if you're not well or not as optimal as you want to be, then you have to focus on this part quite significantly. It's part of the journey to recovery to health. And our goal is to teach you enough, and you know, we can't cover everything that I covered in the book with its 36 chapters and 600 pages, 450 references, but we can give you the nuts and bolts start of it, and then you can go reference to that and look at the other components that you want to work with. So once again, you know, we want to, you know, thank you very much for joining us today. I want you to work hard on how you can minimize the toxins you're taking in the air, water, and food, and then clean up what's already there. So it's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight.
We didn't make it through all of the suggestions that we had for you guys, so we'll make sure that we type it up and stick it on the blog.
That's right. So that'll be on the blog, and again, it'll be on the blog at drbillcode.com, DRBILLCODE. And that is where this one and the other ones will be, as well as the notes that Kristina and her colleagues and I put together. So that will give you short additional notes that you can put in, and you can work from there. So have a great week.
Yeah, and we'll see you next Tuesday, same time, 4 o'clock. And we were thinking of making the topic for next week electrosmog.
Electrosmog. I'm watching this week, and you guys can watch it too if you want to. The 5G Summit. Okay, because it's free all this week. And we will talk about electromagnetic energy and electrosmog from a whole composite of ways next week. We'll work hard at help you understand how you can minimize it the best ways. We've got a chapter already in the book done by my naturopath colleague, Dr. Terry Jacklin. And then at the end of that chapter is the 10 or so choices that you can make to really reduce your electrosmog, because that's another part of detoxification. Okay.
All right. So don't forget to share this video with your friends and community, and we will see you next week.
Thank you again.